The calendar said November 3, 2008, a Monday that began like countless others in Naples, Florida. The sun climbed over palm-lined streets. Office workers poured coffee. Attorneys reviewed files. Couples with fraying marriages took their seats in a building designed for calm resolutions. The Collier County Courthouse was never meant to be a place of terror. It was built for endings, papers signed, property divided, custody schedules set, for people to walk out carrying disappointment, not body bags. That morning, Rebecca Smith arrived early. She was prepared for something uncomfortable, not catastrophic. A divorce hearing is rarely easy, but it is supposed to be civil, procedural, controlled. She had no way of knowing that the man she was divorcing had already decided the court would not end their marriage. He would. To friends and colleagues, Joseph Smith was a familiar presence. He worked in the construction industry. He could be charming, persuasive, even generous when it suited him. But as the marriage deteriorated, those close to Rebecca noticed changes that worried them. Jealousy sharpened. Control tightened. Anger simmered beneath the surface. Divorce to Joseph wasn't a legal process. It was an attack, a humiliation, a loss of dominance he could not accept. Court records would later show a history of disputes. Friends would recall arguments that lingered too long. And yet, like so many volatile situations, it moved forward under the assumption that rules and security would keep everyone safe. They didn't. The Collier County Courthouse bustled that morning. Security was present, metal detectors, deputies stationed near entrances. The system worked on the belief that visible authority deters violence. It often does. But deterrence assumes the person approaching the door still fears consequences. Joseph Smith no longer did. He arrived armed. Witnesses later described hearing popping sounds, the kind that confuse the mind before terror clarifies it. Then screams, then people running. Inside the courthouse, Joseph Smith opened fire. He targeted Rebecca first. There would be no argument, no hearing, no judge to interrupt. In seconds, the promise of a simple divorce collapsed into chaos. As gunshots echoed through corridors, deputies rushed toward the noise. Civilians scrambled for cover, ducking into offices, hiding beneath desks, pressing against walls with hearts hammering. The courthouse transformed from a place of order into a maze of fear. Joseph moved with purpose. This was not an accident. This was not spontaneous rage. This was a plan carried out in public. Among the first to respond were courthouse deputies, men and women trained to protect, not to retreat. They knew the risks. They moved anyway. In the exchange of gunfire, Deputy Chief James Kavanaugh and Deputy Terry Lynn would be mortally wounded. They died doing exactly what they had sworn to do. Outside, sirens converged on the courthouse. Helicopters circled overhead. Police sealed the area as terrified family members and co-workers waited for news. Inside, the damage was already done. Joseph Smith had turned a personal grievance into a public massacre. Because it didn't begin with a robbery or a gang dispute or a random act of violence. It began with a divorce hearing, something thousands of people attend every day, trusting that the system will protect them while emotions run high. This case forces an unbearable question. What happens when the person you're trying to leave decides the law doesn't apply anymore? In the aftermath, investigators and journalists would comb through the past. They would ask, were there threats? Were there restraining orders? Were there moments that should have raised alarms? And like many cases of intimate partner violence, the answers would be complicated. Some signs were there, some were minimized, some were only obvious in hindsight. We tell ourselves courthouses are safe. We tell ourselves security is enough. We tell ourselves that anger cools under fluorescent lights and legal procedure. But on that morning in Naples, Florida, a man walked into a courtroom carrying something far heavier than a grievance. He carried the belief that if he couldn't control the outcome, he would destroy it. The first gunshot did not sound like a gunshot. People later said it was a pop, a crack, a noise their brains tried to mislabel because accepting the truth took too long. Inside the courthouse, fluorescent lights hummed, papers rustled, and then suddenly, everything broke. A scream cut through the corridor, another crack followed, and then the building that promised order became a maze of fear. Rebecca Smith had come to court expecting formality and discomfort. She did not expect violence. Witnesses would later describe seeing her fall in the hallway outside the courtroom. No time for argument, no chance for a plea. The sound ricocheted off tile and glass. Doors flew open. People ran without knowing where safety was, only that staying still was no longer an option. Joseph Smith moved with purpose. This was not the flailing rage of a man surprised by his own anger. This was a decision already made. Inside nearby offices, attorneys pushed clients into back rooms. Clerks dove under desks. A mother pulled her child close and pressed them both into a corner, whispering for silence. The courthouse had rehearsed emergencies on paper, but paper plans don't account for the way terror bends time, how seconds stretch, how choices feel impossibly heavy. Deputies heard the shots and ran toward them. Courthouse deputies didn't have the luxury of confusion. Training took over. Radios crackled. Hallways filled with echoes as boots hit tile. Two deputies, men and women who had started their day expecting routine, encountered the shooter. The exchange was brief and violent. In the chaos, they were struck. They fell doing exactly what their oath demanded, placing themselves between a gunman and the public. In those moments, the courthouse learned what courage costs. As shots rang out, security initiated lockdown procedures. Doors slammed, elevators stopped, people hid in stairwells and storage closets, holding their breath as footsteps passed. Phones vibrated with incoming calls that went unanswered. Outside, families and co-workers gathered, eyes fixed on the building, trying to read the future through tinted glass. Inside, time fractured. Witnesses would later reconstruct Joseph Smith's movement through the courthouse, where he paused, where he turned, where the echoes seemed to chase him. There was no negotiation, no demand, no manifesto shouted to the ceiling. This was not about publicity, it was about control, ending the process that symbolized loss. Eventually, the gunfire stopped. The silence that followed was not relief, it was disbelief, the kind that settles before reality arrives. Deputies cleared rooms methodically. Sheriff's office, they called, voices steady despite the carnage. One by one, doors opened. People emerged shaking, some crying, some stunned into stillness. Medical teams rushed in. For some, help came too late. News helicopters hovered, sirens layered over one another. The courthouse steps filled with uniforms and stretchers, and the grim choreography of aftermath. Word spread quickly. This was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, not a fight that escalated. It was a massacre born from a domestic dispute that turned public. As the building was secured, officials confirmed what many feared. Multiple people had been killed, including courthouse deputies who responded to the threat. Flags would later lower, names would be spoken with reverence. Families would receive visits no one should ever have to endure. And the city of Naples would wake up the next day changed. How did a man enter a courthouse with a weapon? Were there warning signs before the hearing? What more could have been done? These questions surfaced within hours, and they would not fade. Because when violence erupts in a place designed to resolve conflict, it shatters a fundamental promise of safety. Courts are where we ask people to settle their most personal conflicts under rules instead of fists. We expect tempers to cool under procedure. We expect the presence of law to restrain the worst impulses. But that morning proved something painful. Rules only matter if the person standing before them still believes in consequences. Long after the headlines, survivors would remember the small things: the sound of a lock clicking, the feel of a stranger's hand gripping theirs in the dark, the way a deputy's voice stayed calm while telling them to hide. These moments didn't make the news, they made the memory survivable. Domestic disputes are often framed as private tragedies. This one refused that boundary. It forced a reckoning with how intimate partner violence can spill into public spaces, and how institutions must anticipate that risk, not minimize it. Because the danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it walks in carrying paperwork. In the days after the shooting, Naples went quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The courthouse stood sealed and solemn, its doors closed not by policy, but by grief. Flags were lowered, vigils flickered in the evenings, and behind the scenes, investigators began the work that always follows public horror. They went backward. Detectives combed through Joseph Smith's recent history with a question that had already hardened into an accusation. Was this preventable? They pulled court filings, they reviewed phone records, they interviewed friends, co-workers, neighbors, anyone who had seen the couple in the months leading up to the hearing. What emerged wasn't a sudden snap, it was a slow boil. Rebecca Smith had taken steps that many people take when a relationship becomes dangerous. She filed for divorce, she leaned on friends, she tried to keep the process formal and contained. Joseph, however, interpreted the filings as humiliation. To him, court wasn't a neutral place, it was a stage where he believed he would lose control publicly. Witnesses later described him as obsessed with the hearing date, replaying imagined outcomes, spiraling into anger. In domestic violence research, this moment is well known: separation escalation. The risk increases not during the relationship, but when someone tries to leave. Investigators learned that Joseph had spoken darkly about the hearing. His words were often vague, complaints about being ruined, about not letting it happen, about making sure everyone knows. Vagueness is dangerous. It gives listeners room to rationalize. Friends told themselves he was venting. Co-workers told themselves he was stressed. The system told itself procedure would contain the conflict. And yet one detail cut through the fog. Joseph had been asking pointed questions about courthouse security. He wanted to know where deputies stood, how people entered, whether judges were present at specific times. At the time, the questions were dismissed as curiosity, maybe anxiety about court. After the shooting, they sounded like rehearsal. Courthouses rely on layers of protection: screening, presence, protocol. Investigators examined how Joseph had entered armed, reviewing logs and camera footage frame by frame. They found a failure chain, small gaps that lined up at the worst possible moment. No single lapse told the story. Together, they did. Security works best against opportunists. Joseph Smith was not improvising. The investigation paid special attention to the deputies who ran toward the gunfire. Their actions were mapped minute by minute, not to assign blame, but to honor clarity. They did what training demanded. They did what conscience required. They faced a man who had already decided how the day would end. And they bought time for strangers they would never meet again. Experts were brought in to explain what Naples had witnessed. The language was clinical, but the truth was brutal. Domestic violence is often treated as a private matter until it explodes in a public place. Courthouses, ironically, are flashpoints. They gather people at their most emotionally volatile. They create visible winners and losers, and they promise consequences to someone who may feel he has nothing left to lose. Investigators reviewed whether restraining orders were discussed, whether warnings were logged, whether risk assessments were performed. Some boxes were checked, some were not, and some questions had no satisfying answer, only the ache of hindsight. Because prevention isn't about certainty, it's about probability. As details emerged, the public reaction shifted from shock to anger. Why weren't threats taken more seriously? Why wasn't the hearing postponed? Why didn't someone step in? Officials explained what they could. They promised reviews. They pledged changes. But explanations never feel adequate when lives are lost. Metal detectors were upgraded. Deputy presence increased. Protocols tightened. These changes mattered, but they were born from loss. And the families of the dead carried a truth no policy could undo. Reforms arrive after tragedy, not before. Friends of Rebecca Smith spoke about her resolve, the way she believed the law would protect her, the way she trusted process over confrontation. She did what society asks people to do. That trust would become the most painful part of the story. Because the massacre wasn't just a burst of violence, it was the end of a sequence, one that many communities quietly live with every day. Warning signs that sound like venting, questions that seem harmless, procedures that assume cooperation, and a final moment where the assumptions collapse. When the gunfire stopped inside the Collier County Courthouse, there was no chase to finish and no trial to await. Joseph Smith was killed during the response, his final decision ending the violence even as it sealed the damage forever. What remained was silence and the slow, heavy work of reckoning. Officials confirmed the toll. Rebecca Smith, the woman who came seeking a lawful end to a marriage, was dead. 2 deputies, James Kavanaugh and Terry Lynn, had been mortally wounded running toward danger. The shooter was down. The public often expects clarity when a case ends quickly, but speed does not equal closure. When a massacre unfolds in a place meant to resolve conflict peacefully, the questions multiply. How could this happen here? What did the system miss? What would change now that it was too late? Naples gathered to mourn. Candles flickered along courthouse steps. Law enforcement from across Florida arrived to honor the fallen. Badges were pinned with black bands. Names were spoken slowly, deliberately, so they wouldn't be swallowed by headlines. Friends remembered Rebecca Smith as composed and determined, a woman who believed the law could protect her during a painful transition. Deputies Kavanaugh and Lynn were remembered for the same reason: belief, in duty, in service, in stepping forward when others had to hide. Their families absorbed a grief no policy could ease. Within days, internal reviews began, not to assign criminal blame, the shooter was dead, but to examine process. Security screening, how weapons entered and how layers failed together. Risk indicators, whether threats or fixation should have elevated the hearing's security posture. Domestic violence escalation, how separation moments heighten danger and how courts can anticipate that risk. The conclusions were sobering. No single lapse caused the massacre. Instead, small, ordinary assumptions aligned at the worst possible time. Courthouses are designed for cooperation. This attack exploited that design. Reforms followed, quickly and publicly. Enhanced screening and staffing during family court dockets. Revised threat assessment protocols when hearings involve volatile separations. Training focused on separation escalation, not just prior violence. These changes mattered. They likely saved lives elsewhere. They arrived after lives were lost here. Procedure is not protection when someone rejects consequences. Experts testified and wrote op-eds explaining a reality that felt cruel in its simplicity. The most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is when someone tries to leave, and the most dangerous place can be the one designed to formalize that leaving. Courts ask people to bring their worst moments into a public room and trust rules to keep everyone safe. Most days, that trust is honored. On this day, it was shattered. Without a trial, justice took a different shape. It lived in memorials and policy changes, in scholarships and training programs named after the fallen, in deputies who studied this case and promised themselves they would never underestimate fixation again. For families, justice was quieter, private, incomplete, and permanent. The Collier County Courthouse reopened. Life resumed with extra layers of metal and manpower. People returned to file papers and sit on benches, carrying the memory of what happened there. The legacy is not fear, it is attention. Attention to warning signs that sound like venting. Attention to questions about security that feel curious. Attention to the moment when leaving becomes dangerous. Because it wasn't a random act, it was a chain, and chains can be broken earlier if we recognize where they tighten. Should family courts automatically increase security during high-conflict separations? How can systems better identify fixation before it turns violent? What responsibility do institutions have when procedure meets obsession? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. If this story made you think differently about safety, trust, and prevention, like this video, subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigation. For more chilling, real true crime stories, watch the next video that appears on your Now.